Imagine this. You wake up, you check the news, and you see that an indicted head of state, Nicolás Maduro, was captured. Not in some neutral country, but in a swift, lightning military strike deep inside Venezuela. He's bundled onto a U.S. warship and then flown straight to New York to face federal charges. I mean, this isn't a movie script.
No.
This is the unprecedented reality of Operation Absolute Resolve. It's an event that, I think, instantly redefined the rules of the game for the 21st century.
It's a true global shockwave. You really can't overstate the scale of this. It's huge, particularly because the capture itself achieved a very specific, very immediate U.S. domestic goal.
Right, arresting an alleged narco-terrorist.
Exactly. But in doing so, it has immediately provoked this widespread international condemnation for violating what is, a fundamental principle of state sovereignty.
Absolutely. So for you, the learner, we have amassed a huge stack of sources covering every single angle of this. I mean, we've got the minute-by-minute military execution reports, the complex and, frankly, completely conflicting legal justifications being argued in Washington versus what's being screamed in the halls of the UN.
A total split.
We've got the immediate global market reaction and, of course, the massive, confusing geopolitical backlash that is, right now, shaping the future of the entire Western Hemisphere.
And our mission today is really to cut through that noise. We want to impartially present the facts and the sharply conflicting viewpoints that are in all this source material.
Yeah.
The central tension we're going to explore is crucial. Was this action truly a law enforcement operation, which is what the U.S. government claims?
Or was it an act of war, as U.S. adversaries are claiming?
Or maybe was it something else entirely? Perhaps the aggressive launch of a new oil-fueled economic strategy designed to secure the world's largest reserves.
And our sources give us compelling evidence for all three interpretations.
They do. And we need to look at each one very carefully.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the sheer audacity and scale of the operation itself. The sources describe it as having been planned for months.
Yeah, this wasn't a snap decision.
No, this was a highly complex extraction mission, and it had a code name, Operation Absolute Resolve.
That planning element is so critical. It adds so much context to how it was finally executed. The source material details that the operation had been repeatedly delayed.
Why?
Well, reportedly due to weather. Bad weather that could have compromised this highly sensitive fleet of aircraft.
So they were waiting for the perfect window.
Precisely. We know of at least 2 previous attempts that were scrubbed, one around Christmas Day and then another one on New Year's Day. So that tells you something about their operational patience.
That patience ended late on a Friday night. The final decision, the final go-ahead, came from President Trump on January 2nd. He gave the approval at 10:46 p.m. Eastern.
And the location itself is fascinating.
Right, not the Situation Room.
No. He gave the order from a makeshift secure facility at Mar-a-Lago. It really underlines the sudden high-stakes nature of the final approval, even after all those months of planning.
And once that decision was made, the forces they mobilized were, well, they were just overwhelming.
Completely overwhelming, and that directly contradicts the claim that this was some kind of routine law enforcement action.
So what are we talking about numbers-wise?
We're talking about 200 service members on the ground, mostly special forces, but they were supported by an absolute armada of 150 aircraft.
150?
Taking off from 20 different locations across the Western Hemisphere, many of them from U.S. military bases in allied nations.
Let's just linger on those 150 aircraft for a second, because the technical details here, they're crucial for understanding the military message that was being sent. I mean, why deploy strategic assets for what they're calling a targeted arrest?
That's a multi-billion-dollar question, right? And it gets really interesting when you look at the roster of planes.
What was in the air?
Well, the list alone speaks to a maximum force projection. It was designed to deter any intervention, whether from Venezuelan, Cuban, or even Russian forces that were in the region.
So they were sending a message before they even fired a shot.
A very loud one. We're looking at strategic assets like B-1 Lancer bombers. These are heavy, long-range, supersonic aircraft.
Capable of carrying what, a couple dozen cruise missiles each?
Up to 24 JSSM cruise missiles each,
Yeah.
Their presence was largely symbolic, but it was a powerful symbol, making sure the Venezuelan military understood the severity of the threat if they even thought about intervening.
So the B-1s were basically this giant aerial hammer, just poised to drop if anything went wrong.
Precisely. And they were accompanied by a full spectrum of fighter and air superiority planes. You had F-18s, the stealth F-22 Raptors, and the versatile F-35s.
But it wasn't just about firepower, was it?
No, maybe even more crucial were the electronic warfare planes, the EA-18 Growlers, the E-2 Hawkeye command and control aircraft. These planes are designed to do one thing very well: jam enemy radar and communications.
So they could operate invisibly.
Virtually undetected and without any interference once they entered Venezuelan airspace.
Which brings us to the element of surprise and the timeline of the execution. The sources say the raid itself began at 2:10 a.m. local time in Caracas, and they used this powerful, coordinated tactic.
Yes, the fog of war here was entirely engineered. At the same time as the initial troop movements, the U.S. launched a large-scale, high-intensity cyber attack.
And this wasn't just aimed at military targets.
No, not at all. It rendered much of Caracas powerless. It plunged major areas of the city and critical communication lines into total darkness.
What's the strategic purpose of that?
It served multiple purposes. One, it hindered internal communications for the Venezuelan military, making it nearly impossible for them to mobilize quickly. And two, it physically masked the incoming air forces in the dark.
That cyber-physical component was critical then for the extraction forces, who were led by the Army's elite Delta Force. What was their journey like?
The flight path itself was extremely high risk. The extraction forces used helicopters, and they were reportedly flying as low as 100 feet above the Caribbean to stay under the radar.
100 feet? Wow.
It requires incredible skill, precise coordination, all designed to put that team on the ground before any kind of effective resistance could be mounted.
And once they were on the ground, the speed was just breathtaking. The timeline is almost unbelievable.
It is.
The Special Forces team arrived at Maduro's compound at 2:01 a.m., and we should be clear, this isn't some remote bunker we're talking about.
No, the sources describe it as a fort with thousands of people and soldiers guarding it. It's a heavily fortified position.
So they expected resistance?
Oh, initial resistance was fully expected, and it was met. As the commandos got to the inner ring of security, they immediately came under fire.
And the U.S. response?
According to the official U.S. reports, Delta Force responded with overwhelming force and self-defense, which, was necessary given the concentration of armed guards there.
And here's where the story just turns into something straight out of a movie. The sources reveal the dramatic end of the capture, focusing on Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, and their attempt to escape.
That's right. They tried to flee into what they likely thought was their last refuge, a steel-reinforced safe room inside the compound.
But they didn't make it.
No. Whether it was the speed of the operation or maybe a mechanical failure, they couldn't get the door closed in time before they were taken into custody.
That detail really underlines the sheer panic of the moment.
And the narrow window of success for the assault team, yeah. The capture itself was secured by Justice Department officers who were embedded with Delta Force.
Which reinforces their whole law enforcement narrative.
It's a very deliberate part of the story.
And we have specific details on injuries sustained, which proves how kinetic this engagement was. Maduro reportedly suffered a leg injury.
And his wife, Flores, a head injury, during the chaos of the capture itself. By 3:29 a.m., just a little over 2 hours after the raid began, the extraction was complete.
So now let's talk about the human cost, because this is where the accounts diverge sharply, and it's where we find some of the most profound geopolitical insights in this whole story.
This is a critical point. The U.S. reported its own casualties as relatively minimal given the scale of the fight. 7 service members injured.
And most of them went right back to duty.
5 of them were quickly returned to duty, with 2 needing more recovery. 1 helicopter was hit by ground fire, but remained fully flyable.
But the opposing casualty count is far, far higher, and one specific detail here is just massive.
It is.
U.S. officials confirmed that 24 Venezuelan security officials were killed, but the truly revealing number is the death of 32 Cuban military and police officers who were guarding Maduro.
That's a key piece of information. The fact that Cuba quickly released the names, ranks, and ages of its deceased personnel confirmed what has long been alleged.
That the regime was being propped up by Cuba.
Actively protected by a significant Cuban proxy force embedded within its highest security structures. This wasn't just Venezuelan loyalty, it was state-to-state military protection.
So, while the U.S. confirmed those 56 opposing forces killed 24 Venezuelan and 32 Cuban Venezuelan officials, of course, are pushing back on these figures.
Right, they're claiming the operation also killed civilians and put the total casualty count somewhere around 100 people.
Which is a huge discrepancy.
It is, and it's important to note the conflicting narratives. U.S. officials, for their part, insist that every strike and every shot fired was precisely planned to avoid collateral damage. These higher casualty claims remain unverified by the U.S., but they certainly fuel the global condemnation.
Which we will definitely get to. Now, once they were captured, the transfer itself became part of the diplomatic theater of this whole thing.
Very much so.
Maduro and Flores were first flown out aboard the USS Iwo Jima, a massive U.S. amphibious response group vessel. I even remember President Trump posting a photo online of Maduro,
I saw that.
blindfolded, in handcuffs, wearing a sweatsuit aboard the ship. It just circulated worldwide in seconds.
That photograph was a deliberate humiliation. It was a projection of victory. From the warship, they were transferred directly to New York City to face those federal charges.
And they are now being held at the Metropolitan Detention Center, the MDC, in Brooklyn.
Right. And for those who are unfamiliar, the MDC isn't just any jail.
No, it's a high-security federal holding facility. It's known for housing very high-profile, sometimes notorious, individuals who are awaiting trial in sensitive cases.
The sources note that MDC has been home to people like Ghislaine Maxwell and Sam Bankman-Fried.
So the choice of MDC really underlines the political and media intensity here. They're treating him not just as a former head of state, but as a dangerous flight risk and the central figure in a major narco-terrorism case.
This entire operation, from that 10:46 p.m. green light to his arrival in Brooklyn, was executed with jaw-dropping precision.
But the question remains, and it's a big one.
Yeah.
How does the U.S. justify deploying B-1 bombers and Delta Force to perform what they claim is essentially just serving an arrest warrant?
And that brings us to the legal battleground.
Yeah.
The entire domestic foundation for this action rests on a 2020 federal indictment issued by the Southern District of New York, SDNY.
And this is a crucial distinction, isn't it?
It is. The Trump administration is leaning very heavily on this domestic legal justification to shield the operation from the claims that it was an act of war.
And the charges are not minor. We're talking narco-terrorism conspiracy, cocaine importation conspiracy, and multiple counts related to possessing machine guns and destructive devices.
The indictment, in essence, alleges that Maduro and his inner circle, who they dubbed the Cartel of the Suns, operated a massive, violent criminal enterprise using the entire apparatus of the Venezuelan state.
And this wasn't something that just started.
No, the indictment meticulously paints this picture of systemic, decades-long corruption. It claims this whole thing started way back when Hugo Chavez took power in 1999.
And it alleges that Maduro and his cronies used their positions as foreign ministers, vice presidents, and finally as president to facilitate the trafficking of thousands of tons of cocaine.
Thousands of tons through Venezuela and ultimately toward the United States.
I think the specific corruption allegations in the source material are what truly illustrate the depth of the narco state Venezuela had become. It wasn't just them, looking the other way.
No, it was active facilitation. For example, the indictment details how Maduro, during his time as foreign minister, allegedly sold diplomatic passports to drug traffickers,
giving them safe passage around the globe.
Exactly. He then allegedly facilitated diplomatic flights using state aircraft to repatriate drug proceeds. We're talking millions of dollars from places like Mexico back into Venezuela. He was essentially running a state-sponsored money laundering service.
And the most shocking detail, the one that truly connects the regime directly to the cartels, is the allegation that thousands of kilos of cocaine were loaded onto planes directly at the presidential hangar at the main airport.
That is a direct link between the highest office in the land and the drug trade. There's no ambiguity there.
And it goes further, connecting them to Colombian groups.
It does. The Cartel of the Suns allegedly provided crucial support to these groups. They gave a safe haven and provided weapons, machine guns, grenades to groups like FARC and the ELN who were producing the cocaine across the border.
And that's the narco-terrorism link.
That's it. Supporting and collaborating with internationally designated terrorist organizations to move drugs. That's the legal nexus.
And domestically, they partnered with the violent Trinidad gang, the TDA.
Yes, the TDA is a highly organized, extremely violent Venezuelan gang. The indictment alleges the Cartel of the Suns used them for logistics, for armed escorts of drug shipments, and crucially, for controlling the coastlines to make sure those maritime shipments of cocaine could proceed unimpeded.
So it shows a complete blurring of the lines. State security, political power, organized crime, all one big enterprise.
A complete fusion.
So we have a clear, deep domestic indictment. How does the U.S. government then use that to justify sending in 150 aircraft and Delta Force? This is where the, let's call it, legal innovation of the Trump administration comes in.
It is an innovation.
Yeah.
They characterize this action as purely a law enforcement operation, not an act of aggression, not an act of war.
And that framing is the single most important legal maneuver in this entire operation, isn't it?
It is, because it allows the executive branch to bypass the war powers resolution, which would require prior notification or authorization from Congress for military action.
So it's an end run around Congress.
Essentially. The Deputy Attorney General, Todd Blanche, stated it explicitly. He said the U.S. has an absolute legal right to go and arrest people charged with horrible crimes anywhere in the world.
And the legal basis for that very broad assertion is supported by a new opinion from the Department of Justice's Office of Legal Counsel, the OLC.
The OLC memo is the legal linchpin for this, yes. It's a formal document from the DOJ that provides the legal justification for executive action.
We've seen these before.
We have. Historically, OLC memos justified actions against suspected terrorists abroad, like Anwar al-Awlaki, or even strikes against drug trafficking boats in international waters. This new memo specifically justifies the raid by arguing the president has authority under Article 2 of the Constitution to protect U.S. interests and citizens.
But how do they connect Maduro to an imminent threat that would justify that kind of executive power?
Well, the argument is twofold. First, the charges classify Maduro as a participant in an armed conflict, this narco-terrorism conflict, that directly harms U.S. citizens through the drug trade.
And it's second.
Second, the administration framed it as a necessary defense mechanism. Trump claimed that naval operations leading up to the raid had already knocked out 97% of drug boats coming to the U.S. by water. The implication is you have to remove the head of the snake, the source of the organization Maduro, to stunts the imminent flow of drugs.
So they're saying the head of a narco-terror organization threatening the U.S. falls under executive war powers and domestic criminal jurisdiction, regardless of his title.
That is the core of their argument.
This domestic legal gymnastics immediately ran into the reality of a New York courtroom. Maduro and Flores pleaded not guilty at their arraignment, but it was Maduro's defiance that made the real headlines.
Yes, he was absolutely defiant. He proclaimed, "I am innocent. I am still president of my country." And then, crucially, he told a bystander, "I am a kidnapped president," and powerfully stated, "I am a prisoner of war."
And that right there establishes his entire defense strategy. He's claiming political kidnapping and immunity.
And his defense lawyer, Barry Pollock, is certainly expected to argue for sovereign immunity, citing Maduro's status as the sitting, if disputed, head of state.
But we've seen this exact argument before, haven't we, with Noriega?
We did. And that's why legal experts are predicting the sovereign immunity argument is going to fail, drawing that direct comparison to the 1989 capture and trial of Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega.
So remind us, why did that argument fail for Noriega, and why is it expected to fail for Maduro?
It failed because the U.S. government, at the time of Noriega's capture, did not recognize him as the legitimate head of state of Panama. They recognized the opposition government.
And that's the exact situation now.
It's the exact same situation.
Yeah.
The U.S. has long recognized Juan Guaido and the opposition as the legitimate government of Venezuela. Therefore, under U.S. law, Maduro is simply a de facto illegitimate leader.
And thus, he's entitled to no immunity.
No immunity. The indictment itself refers to him as the de facto but illegitimate leader. His claim of prisoner of war status is simply irrelevant in a federal criminal court.
That distinction, whether the U.S. recognizes him as legitimate, it completely dictates his legal standing in New York.
It's everything.
The judge presiding over this momentous case is U.S. District Judge Alvin Hellerstein, who is, I believe, 92 years old, a Clinton appointee.
Judge Hellerstein is notable because he's already handled high-profile Venezuelan narco-terrorism cases. He presided over the guilty plea of Hugo El Polo Carvajal, another former Venezuelan general involved in this same drug trade.
So he knows this case inside and out already.
Carvajal's cooperation likely provided new, valuable evidence for this very case, giving Judge Hellerstein deep institutional knowledge of the cartel of the Suns.
So, on one hand, you have this domestic legal machine running smoothly, fortified by the OLC memo and the Noriega precedent. But while all this is happening in Brooklyn, the international community has erupted.
Erupted in unified condemnation. Yeah.
And that condemnation is sweeping. It centers entirely on the principle of state sovereignty.
It does. Experts, including the UN Special Rapporteur, stated explicitly that a country cannot enforce its law on the territory of another sovereign state without consent.
If we just simplify the political science language here, what's the core violation?
The core violation is the non-use of force principle, which is foundational to the UN Charter and all of modern international law. In simple terms, it says you cannot send your soldiers into another country to do police work. Full stop.
No matter who you're trying to arrest.
Doesn't matter. Not without the consent of that sovereign state. For the U.S. to seize an indicted individual, even one properly charged in a U.S. court, without Venezuela's consent, violates this clear limit on enforcement jurisdiction.
And this is regardless of whether the U.S. views Maduro as illegitimate.
Precisely. The principle of head of state immunity, which has been affirmed by the International Court of Justice, means that even if he's a dictator, as long as he's the de facto leader, he holds that status for international legal purposes.
And the UN Secretary General weighed in on this.
He did. He expressed deep concern that international law has not been respected and worried about the dangerous precedent this sets for how states interact in the future.
France's reaction was particularly strong, especially given they're a permanent member of the UN Security Council.
France's foreign minister condemned the operation as contravening that principle of non-use of force. He warned that increasing violations of this principle by powerful nations will have serious consequences for global security.
So he's essentially saying the U.S. is risking tearing up the international rulebook.
That's the fear.
And we can't overlook the domestic pushback in the U.S., which further complicates this narrative of unified government action.
That's right. Democratic leaders in Congress immediately condemned the intervention, specifically citing the lack of congressional authorization. They saw it as an unauthorized military action.
The Senate even advanced a resolution to try and block this.
A bipartisan resolution, yeah. It was designed to block the president from using further unauthorized military force against Venezuela. It shows significant scrutiny among U.S. lawmakers who viewed this as a massive executive overreach.
So the clash is crystal clear. A successful domestic law enforcement action versus a massive, globally condemned violation of international sovereignty. But the underlying motivation, as the source material reveals, seems to be less about the arrest warrant itself.
And more about the enormous economic prize lurking beneath Venezuela's soil.
We need to transition to that economic calculus because it explains why Washington appears willing to risk all this global scorn for what lies beneath Venezuela's ground.
Absolutely.
To understand the prize, we first need to appreciate the depth of Venezuela's economic collapse. Nicolás Maduro inherited an economy already damaged by Hugo Chavez, but he drove it completely into the ground.
It's one of the most tragic ironies of the 21st century. I mean, Venezuela sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves that rival Saudi Arabia's.
And yet its economy became a spectacular basket case.
A total basket case due to radical nationalization policies, massive corruption, and just chronic mismanagement.
The numbers are absolutely staggering. Under Maduro's tenure, the country's GDP per capita dropped by a staggering 75% in just 8 years.
75%.
It fell to a paltry $1,500 by 2021. That's a total economic implosion unmatched by almost any peacetime nation in history.
And the lifeblood of the country, its oil production, collapsed right alongside the economy. In 1999, Venezuela was pumping 3.2 million barrels a day.
A huge amount.
A global player. Due to mismanagement, lack of investment, and sanctions, that figure plunged to about 850,000 barrels per day. We're talking about a 75% cut in national production. It left the country totally dependent on illicit means for survival.
And the sources detail those illicit means, the reliance on drug trafficking, as we saw in the indictment, but also the wholesale selling off of massive gold reserves.
Yes. Sources suggest Venezuela sold 179 metric tons of gold since 2022 just to keep the lights on and pay off key allies.
And on top of that, authorities in the UK and Switzerland have frozen billions in assets linked to Maduro and his associates.
Right, which further constricted their ability to operate legitimately. They became utterly dependent on lifelines from allies like China, Russia, and Iran for both technical and financial support.
With Maduro gone, the U.S. quickly asserted a highly controversial new level of control. President Trump announced that the U.S. would temporarily run the country until a safe, proper, and judicious transition could be arranged.
I mean, that is a massive, unprecedented claim in the modern era. It immediately raised the specter of occupation and, neocolonialism.
And he was unequivocal, stating the U.S. was in charge and would dictate where the country goes next.
He went even further, affirming he was not afraid of boots on the ground and was prepared to stage a second and much larger attack if we need to do so to secure the transition according to their plan.
Now, what's interesting is the reaction from Maduro's cronies. While they reacted with initial defiance, The vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, was quickly sworn in as interim president by their Supreme Court.
But there seems to have been an immediate back channel opened.
That's the key tension. Trump officials claim that Rodriguez showed a willingness to cooperate in what Secretary Rubio described as a gracious conversation.
So the U.S. position seems to be seeking cooperation from the existing infrastructure and state bureaucracy, rather than trying a full, top-to-bottom regime change.
They want to use the existing government structure to facilitate the U.S. oil plan.
It seems so.
Which brings us to the core strategic component of this whole intervention, the oil strategy and the compensation. Trump stated the U.S. goal is clearly to tap into Venezuela's massive reserves.
No ambiguity there.
He announced that Venezuela would be required to turn over 30 to 50 million barrels of high-quality sanctioned oil to the U.S. That's an amount worth about $2.8 billion at current market prices.
And the Energy Secretary, Chris Wright, he elaborated on this plan, confirming the strategy is comprehensive. The U.S. would control the sale of Venezuelan crude into the marketplace, both domestically and globally.
And crucially, the revenue from these sales would be deposited into U.S.-controlled accounts,
to be used as powerful leverage for political change and reconstruction. The idea is to ensure the money benefits both the American people by compensating some creditors and the Venezuelan people, rather than lining the pockets of the cartel of the Suns again.
That sounds like a neat solution on paper, but the biggest hurdle, and one the sources detail extensively, is the investment required to get that oil flowing again.
It's a huge hurdle.
The U.S. wants Exxon, Chevron, ConocoPhillips to invest billions to fix the dilapidated infrastructure, but there are massive trust and liability issues here.
This is where the complexity truly lies. Trump claimed he had spoken to all the U.S. oil companies.
But industry sources contradicted that.
Immediately. They said no formal conversations had happened with the biggest companies prior to the raid, though meetings were quickly scheduled after. The key obstacle for these companies isn't just the tens of billions required to fix the broken pipelines and refineries.
It's the political risk.
It's the absolute lack of political stability and the ability to secure their property rights.
We have to remember the history here of nationalization under Chavez. American companies were burned badly.
They were devastated. When Hugo Chavez nationalized oil operations in the 2000s, American companies lost billions in assets. ConocoPhillips, for instance, is still owed a massive $8.7 billion in compensation from a World Bank ruling.
So there's no guarantee that if they invest billions now, a future Venezuelan government, or even a change in the U.S. administration, won't just nationalize those assets all over again.
Exactly. That is a massive anecdote of risk. Why would any rational company invest under those circumstances?
They won't.
Not without ironclad political and legal assurances. Industry experts are highly skeptical. They say they need legislative guarantees from the U.S. Congress, maybe even international treaty assurances, that their property rights will be permanently secured.
Until then, investment will be limited.
Very limited to short-term, low-capital deployments, nothing major.
And Secretary Wright acknowledged this reluctance, right? The goal of returning Venezuela to its historical numbers, around 3.5 million barrels per day, is a long-term, multi-decade project.
Yes, he admitted that achieving historical output would require tens of billions of dollars and significant time.
But he did offer a more immediate goal.
He did. He noted that with smaller capital deployments and some quick fixes, they could get several 100,000 barrels a day of additional production in the short term, which would be enough to meet the immediate U.S. strategic goals.
Finally on this, let's quickly look at the opposition figures. The Nobel Peace Prize winner Maria Corina Machado celebrated the operation as the Hour of Liberty.
But she immediately urged the U.S. to recognize Edmundo González Urrutia, who she claims won the 2024 election.
And the U.S. is managing this very carefully. While they welcomed Maduro's removal, Trump indicated he didn't believe Machado or Urrutia had the necessary support or the respect within the country to lead the transition without U.S. management.
Which suggests the U.S. intends to manage this transition primarily through the economic leverage they now hold over the oil economy, not necessarily by endorsing the traditional opposition figures.
It's a fascinating, messy picture. The U.S. essentially used a massive military and legal action to secure economic leverage over the world's largest oil reserves to dictate a political transition.
And naturally, this has resulted in some explosive reactions across the globe.
Yeah.
The global reaction was swift, and it was sharply polarized along geopolitical lines. On one side, U.S. adversaries immediately condemned the operation, viewing it as a massive infringement of international law and a personal affront.
Starting with China, which is a crucial economic partner and creditor to Venezuela, they condemned the U.S. action in the strongest possible terms.
They did. They branded it a hegemonic act and a gross violation of sovereignty, claiming the U.S. was acting as a world judge.
And Beijing urged Maduro's immediate release.
But the fallout for China goes deeper than just rhetoric. The move was considered a big blow to Beijing standing as a dependable friend to its strategic partners, especially in Latin America.
Because their investments are now at risk.
Exactly. China has invested heavily in Venezuelan infrastructure and debt. The sudden U.S. control means those investments are now at risk of being completely renegotiated or even written off under a new government installed under U.S. influence.
Russia was equally forceful in its condemnation, and its reaction had a distinct military flavor to it.
It did. Russia accused the U.S. of armed aggression and explicitly called the operation an act of piracy, especially after the U.S. seized a Russian-flagged oil tanker linked to Venezuelan oil.
So Russia's saying this is about ideology, not pragmatism.
Yes, they said ideological animosity has prevailed over pragmatism, suggesting the U.S. prioritized removing an anti-U.S. regime over maintaining stability. And crucially, Russian military vessels, including a submarine, were reportedly in the vicinity during the operation.
But no confrontation.
No direct confrontation occurred, which indicates a measure of restraint from both sides.
Iran, Cuba, and North Korea predictably completed the list of adversaries, strongly denouncing the operation.
All of them uniformly denounced it as a violation of sovereignty and demanded an international response. Cuba called it a criminal U.S. attack, focusing on the death of their 32 military personnel.
And North Korea
branded it a serious encroachment of sovereignty. This unified condemnation just reinforces the narrative that this operation represents a severe breach of international norms for rival powers.
Now, compare that to the much more nuanced reactions from U.S. allies in Europe, countries like France, the UK, Germany, and the EU. They faced a very complex diplomatic dilemma.
Their position was incredibly tricky. On one hand, they universally recognized that Maduro lacked democratic legitimacy, and they welcomed his departure as good news. But they uniformly condemned the method used. They had to balance their support for democracy with their foundational respect for international law. So their condemnation centered specifically on infringing that principle of non-use of force, fearing the dangerous precedent this unilateral action sets.
And the Latin American response was extremely mixed, highlighting the deep political divisions in the region itself.
Very mixed. Brazil, a major regional power, called the action an unacceptable line crossing and a serious affront to sovereignty.
Colombia, a crucial U.S. ally, called for de-escalation, but its president, Petro, openly threatened to take up arms.
Yeah, that was after President Trump called him a very sick man and questioned his time in office. This volatile exchange shows the immediate destabilizing effect on U.S. relationships in the hemisphere.
But on the other end of the spectrum, some nations strongly supported the action.
Yes. Ecuador, for instance, under President Daniel Noboa Azin, strongly supported it, warning narco-chavista criminals, your time is coming, and offering support to the Venezuelan opposition.
I guess Ecuador's recent struggle with internal drug gangs made them sympathetic to the narco-terrorism justification.
Very sympathetic.
Now, the sources indicate that this assertive foreign policy is being officially framed by the Trump administration as the launch of the Donroe Doctrine.
That name choice is highly symbolic and highly provocative.
It's a deliberate reference to the 19th century Monroe Doctrine.
Yes, which warned European powers against intervention in the Western Hemisphere. The Donroe Doctrine, however, is being redefined as a sickly safety for the region.
What does that even mean?
It means the U.S. will proactively intervene, militarily if necessary, to ensure its own security and economic interests, particularly against states engaging in narco-terrorism or those aligned with rivals like China and Russia.
So the doctrine sends a clear message to cartels and U.S. rivals.
Absolutely. The official goal is to demonstrate that the U.S. is now willing to act decisively to enforce its priorities, contrasting sharply with previous administrations that relied on, ineffectual red lines. This operation has dramatically raised the perceived credibility of the U.S. willingness to use force. It's putting adversaries on notice.
And President Trump hasn't shied away from hinting at an expanded scope for this doctrine.
Not at all. He predicted future action against Cuba, saying the communist regime would fall without Venezuelan oil and financial support. He also suggested action against Mexico to combat cartels, and even against Colombia.
So this is truly an expansionist threat that relies on the success of Operation Absolute Resolve to maintain its credibility.
It does.
It's also important to mention the counterpoint here. Maduro himself was engaging in expansionism.
That's a crucial detail for context. While the world condemns U.S. aggression, we have to recall that Maduro was actively laying claim to Guyana's oil-rich Essequibo region
Which is two-thirds of Guyana's territory.
after massive oil reserves were discovered there. So this gives an alternative perspective on regional instability. Maduro was far from a peaceful leader who respected borders.
Finally, let's look at the financial fallout, because Wall Street reacted instantly to the economic implications of the raid.
No, the market reaction was overwhelmingly positive. It was a highly validating reaction to the operation's strategic economic intent. The Dow Jones Industrial Average hit an all-time high immediately following the news.
And energy stocks surged.
Energy stocks, specifically Exxon up 2.4% and Chevron up 5.8%, they surged, betting heavily on U.S. access to Venezuela's massive oil reserves. Weapon manufacturers like Lockheed Martin also saw significant gains.
That surge in defense stocks seems directly linked to this Don Roe doctrine.
It is. Analysts are predicting the action could accelerate the momentum for the Trump administration's plan to raise the defense budget significantly, maybe to $1.5 trillion by 2027.
So the financial logic is clear.
Very clear. When threats of military action increase, and when the U.S. demonstrates a willingness to engage in these high-risk, high-reward kinetic operations, defense budgets move higher. The financial markets essentially validated the strategic nature of Operation Absolute Resolve as a success.
The complexity of this entire event, from 2 hours of military action to the global fallout, truly makes it one of the most significant geopolitical moments in recent history. It's challenging long-held assumptions about sovereignty and executive power.
So to synthesize what we've explored for you, Operation Absolute Resolve was a swift, surgically executed military operation. It successfully achieved a significant U.S. domestic goal, the arrest of an indicted narco-terrorist. But it did so at the immediate cost of drawing deep and widespread global condemnation for violating international sovereignty, especially that principle of non-use of force. The ultimate long-term success of this intervention now hinges entirely on whether the U.S. can stabilize Venezuela's economy and secure massive, but frankly, risky U.S. oil investment, all while maintaining control over the political transition.
To recap the key takeaways for you, we saw the staggering military-scale 150 aircraft, including strategic B-1 bombers mobilized from 20 locations for a 2-hour mission, all of it justified by an unprecedented OLC memo framing it as a domestic law enforcement operation. We heard Nicolás Maduro's defiant courtroom plea that he is a prisoner of war, a claim that will almost certainly fail because of the Noriega precedent and the U.S. non-recognition of his legitimacy.
Right.
And perhaps most importantly, we learned the explicit U.S. plan to use control over Venezuela's newly accessible oil revenue, worth billions, as massive leverage to dictate political and economic change in the country.
And that leads us to a final provocative thought for you to consider as you process this deep dive. We've presented the conflicting legal arguments. The OLC memo justifying the seizure as a necessary law enforcement operation under U.S. domestic law versus the near-universal global consensus that it was an illegal act of aggression that violates sovereignty.
Right.
Given that the U.S. is now leveraging control over the world's largest proven oil reserves to dictate the future governance of Venezuela, does the success of this Don Roe Doctrine operation effectively signal that, for the Western Hemisphere, U.S. national law and executive power can now permanently bypass international sovereignty, setting a new, irreversible precedent for engagement that prioritizes American interests above any global consensus?